Okay, the agenda will talk briefly about the domains of MIT activity that are implicated in the genocide in Gaza. These include research sponsorships by the Israeli military and government. They also include institutional collaborations with the Israeli government and its arms suppliers. We'll discuss some of the MIT precedent for action and what we've done in the past and what must be done in the future. It's probably no surprise to you all that MIT has a special relationship with the US military. It has thousands of military officers that have come to MIT. It's one of I think the third largest defense contractor in Massachusetts. And, from the beginning, MIT students have been very vocal in contesting this, in trying to move the institution away from war and violence and towards peaceful pursuits. For instance, in the 1930s, MIT had a number of engagements with Nazi Germany, and there were students then, as there are now, who were demanding an arms embargo, who demanded that this should not happen. That continued in the 1970s and 60s with the Vietnam War. There were mass protests at the instrumentation laboratory. And today, going through into the 90s and the 80s, on the left here is the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa. And on the right is the original coalition against apartheid that formed on campus to demand MIT divest. We continue that legacy today as MIT students, not just through the encampment, which received a lot of press attention, but also through the campaigns that we've launched since then in the past year and a half, and even before then. There are basically 5 domains of MIT activity that we could consider involved in the Israeli genocide in Gaza. Like many schools, we have a large endowment. It's the 5th largest in the United States. Like Mass Peace Action's campaign to divest the pension funds, this endowment is also likely invested in companies that arm the State of Israel. The Lincoln Laboratory is a unique center. It's one of the Pentagon's R&D centers. 90% of the funds come from the Department of Defense. They just received a new contract from the Air Force until 2030, and MIT is the only university that has this kind of research center. In addition, about 1/5 of campus research funding comes from the Department of Defense, and if you count all the federal sources, that's about half. And you'll notice that even throughout Trump's budget cuts to the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, and so on, the DoD funding has stayed relatively the same, and it's going to occupy a larger share of MIT's research funding flows in the future. Now, these 3 sources are kind of black boxes to us. We don't know the endowment. It's dynamically managed. They don't give us any access to the portfolio. Lincoln Laboratory research is classified, and DoD funding, we still haven't fully mapped out all those lines of complicity. However, we do know that the Israeli Ministry of Defense, this is the armed forces of the Israeli government, directly sponsor MIT research on campus. That is not classified, and so we can access that. We also have noted a number of institutional commitments by MIT to arms providers to the apartheid state. This includes Israel Aerospace Industries, Abets Systems, Maersk, Boeing, and so on. Now, our argument from the beginning on these financial and research ties is that they are immoral and they must be cut, and that the use cases of the research are irrelevant to that moral claim. Academic freedom is not an excuse for this kind of thing. To illustrate why that should make sense, you have to think about Jeffrey Epstein. He's in the news a lot right now, one of Donald Trump's friends. He used to be a donor to MIT. He donated a lot to the Media Lab, for instance. When activists exposed those ties to Jeffrey Epstein, nobody in the MIT administration began talking about the use cases of the research, how important it is to study Alzheimer's or cancer research or climate research or whatever. What mattered then was that Jeffrey Epstein was a convicted sex offender and he was sponsoring research, and that was immoral. Okay, so that's the first point. And oftentimes in MIT's own communications, they will try to mislead people and say that's not the real claim, but that's the claim. The second point, though, is that even though the ties themselves are immoral, the research itself is also unethical on its own basis. And that's because of its potential uses and likely applications. And we know that from the way it's presented, from reading through the research itself. But this point in the first one matters the most, and it's the easiest to understand. So I'm going to pass it off to Mila to talk about those two things, and then I'll wrap it up at the end.
Like Richard said, a lot of this stuff is a black box for us, but not everything. So MIT for a long time uploaded its report on sponsored research activity, aka the Brown Books. These are these big spreadsheets, sort of like a little excerpt here, which lists the PIs or the supervisors that individual grants are routed to, how much money each grant is, the source of the money, and the titles of these grants. So you can see a couple example ones here. And MIT, to its credit, did this for a number of years. However, just a couple months ago, almost certainly in response to our activism, they have taken all of these records offline, assured people helpfully that if you want to go to the physical library and troll through thousands of pages, you're welcome to do so. We're going to stop putting this information out in the future, presumably to avoid further scrutiny over their ties to the Israeli military and other human rights abuses. So in addition to that database, there was another grant database, Qualicios, which was actually taken down, or rather, public access was revoked entirely, once again, due to our activism. You can see a more detailed view of the Brown Book here. From our research, we know that these sponsorships go back around 17 years and that the Israeli Ministry of Defense is the only foreign military to sponsor MIT research. So how is this money routed? Like much of Israeli military spending, the ultimate source is the United States Department of Defense, which sends billions of dollars in military aid to Israel. Specifically, they give the Ministry of Defense a bunch of money with the proviso that it has to be spent back within the United States, and the place that they choose to spend that money, or the place that they like allow their grant requests to receive proposals from, is our school, MIT. And again, this is all the direct military research done by MIT labs for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So there are many of these. I'm going to walk through a couple of them, give you a flavor of what kind of research is done. First, of course, the administration has been very assiduous in saying that this research is not military. It's basic and open, and that suggestions that any of these labs' research is designed for conflict are untrue. I am omitting the name of the lab here because many students have actually been given no contact orders with several of these professors to discourage public discussion of this military financing. So don't go to Sally for your take on this. Go to Special Rapporteur for the United Nations, Francesca Albanese, who specifically states that MIT conducts weapons and surveillance research funded by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. In fact, MIT is the only US university named by the United Nations in their report on complicity in the Gaza Genocide. So here's one of these grants. The title is Field Capable Bacterial Biosensors, which doesn't make a lot of sense on a quick skim, especially how this would be related to the military. But when you start poking around the papers that are funded by these grants, you can see this one, for instance, funds the development of bacteria which fluoresce in a non-visible range when they are in contact with TNT. And so the way this is sometimes framed is as humanitarian. It's something to help clear out minefields, right? Because you spritz the bacteria everywhere, you send some drones over, you pick up the fluorescence, you find the mines. But of course, one has to ask who put those mines there? What are those mines doing there? And the real answer is almost certainly that the Zionists want to use this sort of tech to clear mines that they placed in order to expand their settlements, or to clear out minefields placed by enemy combatants so they can launch aggressive ground invasions into places like Syria, southern Lebanon, with less resistance. And so again, this might sound like supposition. If you go to the papers, this is a figure from one of this IDF lab's papers. You can see a little car there scanning the ground underneath for TNT, tunnels. And we thought the car looked familiar. So if you try to look it up, it is actually an IDF armored Jeep, an armored personnel carrier. So again, these are MIT labs taking Israeli military money to do research with clear combat applications, using images of IDF vehicles within their papers, while the MIT administration continues to insist that none of this research is actually designed for combat. Of course, what has drawn the most attention at MIT is our research on drones and drone swarms for the Israeli military. Here's yet another grant, Autonomous Robotic Swarms, Distributed Coordination and Perception, More concretely, what do these grants actually finance? They finance experiments like this. So this video was shot in the middle of MIT campus in a 40-foot by 80-foot like hangar room called the Gaza Center for Autonomous Systems, named after the chairman and former CEO of Northrop Grumman, who's also the primary donor for this facility. What you can see here is a bunch of small UAVs tracking cars on the ground, and the actual research that's being done here is figuring out ways to reduce the Wi-Fi overhead necessary to coordinate all these swarms of drones flying around without bumping into each other or missing their targets. You can see similar work occurring at other Israeli military-funded labs at MIT, working on ways to better facilitate drone swarms and drone tracking. Of course, the compression algorithms focuses on ways to compress the data that is being shuffled between the drones and the controlling processing unit. And again, if you just read these papers, and you can see some quotes on the left, they almost always mention security applications, surveillance applications, defense applications. So again, don't trust us, trust the people that actually write these reports. Even if none of this were the case, if you look at the co-authors for many of these papers, they are actually done in collaboration with weapons engineers at some of Israel's largest weapons companies. So that's a brief overview of directly sponsored Israeli military research at MIT. But of course, we also have a lot of institutional collaborations with various weapons companies. I'm only going to go through a couple right now, but you can consult our published online work for more or ask us about it during the Q&A. So you have all these companies facilitating the genocide. How do they liaise with MIT? They enter into various contractual relationships with a whole host of different MIT programs, each with their own acronym. In a way, this is actually a lot like the US DoD, where they will give these companies access to research, students, professors, allow members of these companies to reside in MIT labs and learn from them, do research with them, etc. One concrete example is CSAIL alliances. It's a way to shuffle companies into our computer science and artificial intelligence labs, who are the ones that do a lot of the drone work I mentioned earlier. So if you look at the publicly listed affiliates of these partnerships, you see a lot of the usual suspects like Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Caterpillar, the Boston Consulting Group, which is responsible for the inhuman acts of the GHF recently. But of course, you also see some really egregious corporations in terms of their complicity, like Israel Aerospace Industries, or IAI. IAI is the largest defense and aerospace company in Israel. It's owned by and run by the Israeli government. They make a lot of the missiles, automated, autonomous armored bulldozers, a lot of weaponry used in Gaza and Palestine. So it was rather shocking to us when we checked their LinkedIn and we see that just a month ago, Israel Aerospace Industries visited MIT. So you can see a picture here of, again, that they're posting of their chief executives at our school. If you look into who all of these people are, you can see on the right there, it's like the president of Israel Aerospace Industries American subsidiary, their chief technology officer. You actually have in this photograph the lead designer of Israel's Arrow anti-ballistic missiles, which are their mainline anti-ballistic missiles. These are the missiles that allowed them to aggress upon Iran unchecked recently. You also have the inventor of the Harop suicide drone, which will autonomously track targets, fly into them, and detonate, and has been used on refugee tents in Massawi, amongst other places. And you can see them here touring around our computer science labs, our quantum engineering labs, our aeronautics and astronomy labs. Putting aside these very, very direct Israeli state connections, you also have some of the largest US military contractors like Boeing, who of course make a lot of the missiles and other munitions used in Palestine. And that's what they're commonly associated with. But now they're pivoting more and more towards autonomous flight. You can see one of their autonomous drones here, the MQ-28. And a lot of this is done by a Boeing subsidiary called Aurora Flight Sciences. Now, this name might be familiar to you because it is literally right above the Kendall T-stop. It occupies the top floor of this big building here. which is owned by MIT. MIT leases the space used by Boeing's Aurora Flight Sciences to do all their autonomous drone and weapons research. So besides this real estate connection, MIT needs a way to funnel its students into Boeing and Aurora Flight Sciences. One of the main ways it does that is called the MIT New Engineering Educational Transformation, or NEET. The way that they describe themselves is empowering a new era of engineers with career-forward interdisciplinary education. Of course, if you poke around, you can see that this is actually a way to give students a head start on designing autonomous machines. Why do they want to design autonomous machines? So we can help our students collaborate with Boeing. And the way this is all laundered, of course, is not explicit. It's not upfront. No one is telling these 18-year-olds that we are trying to groom you into constructing weaponry used in a genocide. Instead, we get things like the NEET Community Spring Social and movie nights, again, to induct people into building autonomous weapons for Boeing. So in short, the ties to the Israeli military and the genocide are very naked. It's not just about a sponsorship, it's about active collaborations at multiple levels. And I'll let you pick it back up, Richard.
Yes. So there's a question about, does this violate MIT policy and values and the law? And the answer is yes. MIT has expectations about scientific ethics that we're all forced to learn about. MIT has policies about environment, health, and safety, and the need to minimize the adverse effects of our activity on the environment and on global health. I can tell you that aiding and abetting a genocide against the people of Palestine is affecting their health and safety and their environment. MIT's mission is to better humankind. International law, including the Article 3 of the Genocide Convention, and as well as the Rome Statute, both criminalize complicity in genocide, and MIT has its own prohibition on the use of institute property for illegal activity, which should be included under any definition of genocide, right? MIT also has a report. This was created after the Jeffrey Epstein scandal on campus. The authors of this report, Tevneet Suri, who's a professor here, recommended that MIT automatically reject any research sponsor if it answers yes to the following criteria, and that includes having supported or funded any gross violation of political, civil, or human rights, and if it's involved in a gross violation of these rights. Examples of such violations include things like genocide, torture, mass murder, systematic racial segregation, and, quote, deliberate and systematic deprivation of essential foodstuffs. That might sound familiar to you. But MIT has refused to implement this kind of criteria. Instead, it has this elevated risk review process. It only applies that to 3 countries, China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. But this process also indicates, and you can see on the next slide here, if there's any risk that a research outcome will be used in ways that infringe upon political, human, or civil rights in a foreign country, or indirectly legitimize such violations, then that should be one of the criteria for denying that research collaboration. But they do not apply this to Israel. They apply it to China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, but Israel gets off the hook. Now, is there precedent for MIT divestment? The answer is also yes. In 1973, MIT divested from the Draper Laboratory. This followed pressure from student movements against the war in Vietnam. In 2021, following the murder of a Saudi journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, the MIT Energy Initiative cut ties with Saudi Aramco, which is a state-owned oil company in Saudi Arabia. They've also ended engagements with Chinese AI firms who are accused of contributing to the surveillance of Uyghur Muslims. They've also declared that they divested from the Darfur genocide in 2007. So a few more. MIT ended a Taiwan program in 1976 because people were concerned about the proliferation of ballistic missile technology. In the 60s, there was a fluid mechanics laboratory that was run under 2 professors, Asher Shapiro, who's the head of the mechanical engineering department, and Ronald Probstein. They shifted from studying ballistic missiles to things like heart valves and how to clean up oil spills better and desalinize water more efficiently. And they also reconstructed the funding apparatus of that laboratory, which to that point had been dominated by the Pentagon, to civilian sources. And that also followed pressure from radical student movements. In 2019, the Media Lab director, Joy Ito, apologized for taking funds from Jeffrey Epstein and pledged to raise the same amount for survivors of sex trafficking. And MIT ended collaborations with the Skolkovo Institute in Moscow following the invasion of Ukraine. So we've seen them move before on divestment concerns more broadly. Now, the MIT Coalition for Palestine, to give you some context, is made up of 20 different groups on campus. I've highlighted two that have been historically important to our origins: the Coalition Against Apartheid, which was permanently banned and forced underground in January 2024 by MIT, as well as Palestine at MIT, so the Palestinian students. This represents lots of people and lots of groups from different backgrounds. We've had 6 campus votes in the past year and a half on Palestine, and I can tell you that they reflect the majority sentiment of the student body, which supports us. In March and April, the Undergraduate Association and the Graduate Student Union both passed landmark referenda demanding MIT cut its ties with the Israeli Ministry of Defense and provide transitional funding. That was followed by votes in the Graduate Student Council. And then we've also seen in the past semester votes in the Undergraduate Association, Graduate Student Council, demanding solidarity with student activists like Mahmoud Khalil in Colombia, who had been attacked by ICE. So if that gives you not a sense of does MIT as an institution actually care about these kinds of things, but it does give you a sense about where the student body is and where their support lies. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about our wins. There's a video here from the career fair that we could show. This is at the 2024 career fair in September. Some activists put this on a rail and reeled it out, forced Lockheed Martin out of the career fair, actually. They left 3 hours early. They were so embarrassed and overwhelmed by the amount of opposition in the room towards them that they left. We also know Lockheed Martin ended its seed fund program and had one with Misty Israel that was meant to connect students and faculty at MIT to Lockheed Martin's weapons factories in Israel and their offices there. And then an MIT laboratory head has pledged to his own workers in that laboratory to not renew the Israeli Ministry of Defense contract. So we see these as wins. And then in the spring, we forced out Abets Systems from the Industrial Liaison Program. They ended their collaboration probably at the end of 2024. This was done in partnership with BDS Boston, as well as activists in Seoul, South Korea, and Bangkok and Tokyo, who pushed against this. The ILP program has conferences around the world. They went there, they protested, and we weren't super polite. We have to, really push them, make them uncomfortable. But eventually, Abets Systems realized that they need to leave. For some context, Elbit, of course, is like one of Israel's largest arms companies. They make 85% of the Israeli military's drone force. Okay, so what is next? The first thing is that you need to join a BDS campaign. If that's not mass peace action, if you're a student at MIT, join us, help us. And I'm not just talking about boycotting a certain brand of hummus. Like Mass Peace Action, JVP, they have this campaign to divest the state pension funds. That's going on right now. Tonight in the US Senate, Bernie Sanders is forcing a vote to try to end $700 million worth of weapons to the Israeli government. There's initiatives happening locally, like the Somerville divestment effort. MIT students need to come talk to us and join organizers. And we need to build our disruptive power and our embeddedness within MIT's culture and develop some leverage there. I can tell you that over the next year, it's very likely that we are going to continue advocating for MIT to end its ties to the Israeli military, get the Ministry of Defense out of our research, as well as Israel Aerospace Industries out of the CCL alliances. I know it can feel somewhat overwhelming to see all the ways MIT is complicit. I know it's overwhelming for me. But just like the students in the 1930s who went against MIT rules and protested MIT's collaborations with Nazi Germany, in the same way they did that in the 1960s and 70s with Vietnam, and during South African apartheid, we're doing the same now, and that requires some amount of perseverance. I mean, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think the first BDS campaign, so to speak, was in 1971 against Polaroid, which used to make these pass photos for the South African racial segregated pass laws, right? It took, 15, 20 years for that to gain momentum to a state and nationwide effort to isolate South Africa over apartheid. And they won, partially, and there was a democracy established in South Africa in the 1990s. So we must be brave, we must persevere. And that's kind of my final send-off. Mila and I have given a lot to this, but we're not always going to be around. The MIT police are persecuting us in various ways. I haven't been on campus in 2 months. They've barred both of us indefinitely over our activism. We're risking some amount to share this with you, but we cannot bow down to false gods of militarism and greed, and we're not going to be silent when our friends and relatives are being murdered in Gaza. So I'm going to hand it off to Paul. He's going to tell you a little more about what to do from here.